Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining this American Inspiration event presented by American Ancestors in partnership with the Boston Public Library and 10 Million Names. I'm Margaret Talcott, Director of Literary Programs, the creator and producer of this series. All of us behind the scenes are delighted you're with us tonight in the land of American history, looking at colonial Virginia and the lead up to the American Revolution. On your screen is the schedule for our hour-long event centered on the book A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution by Andrew Lawler. Soon, Mr. Lawler will take the screen, and for 40 minutes, he'll discuss this revelatory work of history. Then he'll address your questions about this time, the impetus for revolution, and the spirit of emancipation. We got a number of questions in advance, but we will have time for a few more. So please, we encourage you to enter new queries at any time into the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you sent us a question in the last 24 hours over our advanced registration form, send it again. We need to see those again. So if you have a burning question, put it in the Q&A button. Tonight's event is being produced and recorded by our partners at the Boston Public Library. Their video will be shared in the days ahead with all registered attendees. As good as tonight's talk or their video might be, of course, the real education comes from reading tonight's featured work. Copies of A Perfect Frenzy can be purchased from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They can, of course, also be taken out from your local library. I learned a tremendous amount from this book, facts that were unknown to me, New England and New York sort that I am. I'm sure you'll also learn a lot tonight and in reading Mr. Lawler's work. As you place your order on the bookstore's website, do input the code AMINS25 so they know that your book should come signed by the author on a bookplate. These special copies can be sent anywhere in the United States. Now, for some background on tonight's speaker, and to get us started, over to you, Kristen.
Thank you, Margaret. Good evening and welcome from the Boston Public Library. I'm Kristen Muddy, an adult programs librarian here at the Boston Public Library, and we are thrilled and honored to be in partnership with American Ancestors this evening to bring tonight's talk to you. Thank you for being here. Tonight I have the honor of introducing featured author Andrew Lawler. Andrew Lawler is the author of the national bestseller, The Secret Token, about the lost colony of Roanoke and the award-winning Under Jerusalem. As a journalist, he has written more than 1,000 newspaper and magazine articles for, among many others, the New York Times, Washington Post, National Geographic, and Smithsonian. He is a contributing writer for Science and contributing editor for Archaeology magazines. He lives in Asheville, North Carolina. Now let's welcome Andrew Lawler. Andrew, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you, Margaret, and all the people behind the scenes making this possible, and of course, to the participants this evening who are here listening in. I know we're doing this virtually. It's nice to be doing something with the Boston Public Library since I used to live down the street during some time I lived in Boston. But I'm really delighted to be here to present an aspect of the American Revolution that has gotten way too little attention over the past few centuries. And I intend to change that and hopefully kind of change your view about how the American Revolution began and how our nation was first shaped. So to do that, I'm going to present a PowerPoint and I'll go through it. And then at the end, as Margaret said and Kristen said, we'll have some questions. So first, I need to give you my street creds. I was born in Virginia, and here are some lovely Polaroids, if you're old enough to remember Polaroids, of me when I was about 10, being lugged around by my grandparents, who you see there looking very colonial indeed, to places in Williamsburg, Yorktown, Jamestown. These were the central sites of my childhood, where many of the events I will discuss took place. So my point here is that in Virginia, where I grew up, the revolution was not something we learned in a book. It was something that we actually lived on weekends. Now, the story that we know of the revolution that I learned when I was 10 is a simple one. Yes, we have good guys and bad guys. On the left, of course, we have the bad guy. If you've seen Hamilton, you know that King George III was a terrible tyrant. And we were fortunate enough to have those people on the right: George Washington, Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson. Forgot to include some New Englanders, but right now we're going to focus on the Virginians who helped us to separate from this tyrannical government across the sea. Now, that's the story that most of us probably learned when we were young, but there was another aspect that I learned when I was a child growing up in Norfolk, Virginia. And that was that the real villain of this story was a man named Lord Dunmore. He was he was the last royal governor of the colony of Virginia. He was hated because he attacked Virginia's patriots. He burned my hometown. And there is a cannonball you'll see in the center that was fired by Lord Dunmore January 1st, 1776, as part of a bombardment of the city that landed in a colonial church where you can still see it today. Now, George Washington called him an arch traitor to the rights of humanity. Richard Henry Lee said on the floor of Congress that he was a drunk. And Abigail Adams, she's always good for a quote, isn't she? She said the Virginians had been duped by a Dunmore. So here was a figure that many historians consider to be the first real villain to step onto the stage of the American Revolution. Now, let's talk a little about who he is. I won't go into detail, but I stumbled into a few facts that were at odds with what I'd learned as a child, shown here on this slide, and I began to search a little more deeply into who this person was. So to talk briefly about who Lord Dunmore was, it's necessary to go back to Scotland. He was a Highlander, born with the name John Murray. He joined the 1745 Jacobite Rebellion. This was an effort by a group of British people to overthrow King George II, who was considered a German. They wanted to bring back those Jameses and Charles who'd been on the throne previously, and the revolt was led by Bonnie Prince Charlie. You can see him there in the upper left. Now, he marched through Scotland gathering troops, and among those who joined was our Lord Dunmore, who at that point was about maybe 13 or 14. He and his father joined this rebellion, and they got within 100 miles of London and were able to actually defeat the British Army several times before they were driven back to Scotland, where at the Battle of Culloden, if you ever saw the series Outlander, you know about this story, they were defeated. Now, in the end, his father was convicted of treason, and the young Lord Dunmore finds a way eventually to join the British Army. Later, when King George III takes the throne, he decides that in order to tamp down these constant rebellions from Scotland, that he's going to bring them into the power structure. So our Lord Dunmore, by then, he has received the title of Lord. His father passed away. He becomes a member of the House of Lords, but he still needs a job. He doesn't have that much in the way of cash. So he finally gets a job in the civil service as governor of New York in 1770. But very quickly, the governor of Virginia died, and the king ordered him, pretty much against his will, because Dunmore was somebody who liked big city living. He liked New York. He enjoyed being there, but he was ordered to go to Virginia against his will in 1771. Now, when he arrived in Virginia, let's talk about what kind of a place this was. First of all, it was the oldest, largest, wealthiest, and most populous of all the colonies. You could take all of New England, you could put it into Virginia. There were still more Virginians. It was a rural economy. It was based on tobacco. It was also a place that was primarily a land of plantations. Now, when I say that, think of forced labor camps. These were small farms, essentially, where you might have one white family living in a modest house who might own 2 or 3 or 4 enslaved people who would live in the outbuildings. This was the basic nature of Virginia society. 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved. Now, the planters who dominated the House of Burgesses or the Assembly, they were the ones, the upper crust, the ones at the very top who owned large numbers of enslaved people and land. And land is the key. The tension in Virginia between the gentry and Britain had little or nothing to do with tea or taxes or representation. It had everything to do with their desire to move west. And if you look at the map, you can see those lines of mountains. So to the east, you have the settled areas in the 1770s of Virginia. To the west is the Ohio Valley, where indigenous people lived. Now, speculators like George Washington and others were eager to get this land so they could expand their holdings, bring enslaved people over the mountains, create larger plantations, and gain greater wealth. But King George III had refused their pleas because he didn't want the Indians and the white people fighting. He knew that would lead to an expensive war, which is why they had to impose taxes in the first place, because the French and Indian War was very expensive. So the idea was the white people stay to the right and the Indians on the left, there would be no problems. But this was not something that people like Washington and other Virginia gentry were willing to put up with. This was the essential tension that Dunmore found when he arrived. And when he arrived, he came to Williamsburg. This is the colonial capital. Some of you may have visited the Reconstruction done with Rockefeller money back in the 30s and 40s. It was a small place, a couple thousand residents, half of them enslaved. Dunmore lived in the governor's palace, and he then quickly became one of the good old boys. He bought land, he bought enslaved people, and he made friends with, yes, George Washington. They became very close. Both of them were eager to obtain this land in the Ohio, and they schemed to find ways to convince the king to lift his ban on ownership of land on the other side of the mountains. Now, Dunmore was doing so well. He was quite prosperous. He was accepted by the gentry. He was actually quite beloved by them. And he was comfortable enough to bring his wife, Lady Dunmore, and 6 of their children across the Atlantic Ocean, where they arrived in 1774. Things look good. What could go wrong? Well, there's another piece of Virginia that we want to talk about, another stage in the drama about to unfold, and that is the place called Norfolk. This is a coastal port, has an excellent harbor. At the time of the beginning of the Revolution, it was 3 times the size of Williamsburg and the 8th largest city in North America. It was booming. Wealthy Scots had arrived, captured the tobacco trade, used Norfolk as their headquarters, and with their profits were building distilleries and factories and shipyards at a fast rate. So this was quickly becoming not just a regional port, but an important node in the British Empire. It also was a place where if you were a planter and you needed money, because they were always short on cash, then you would go to a Scottish merchant to get a loan. It was also a place that the enslaved laborers on these tobacco plantations would like to leave and essentially go to the big city, get lost in the alleys, remake yourself, buy some forged papers, get a job on a ship, no questions asked, and thereby obtain a measure of liberty not possible on these forced labor camps in the countryside. So the town became a magnet for enslaved people. Both of these facts, the fact that you have these wealthy Scottish merchants and lots of enslaved people who were often very skilled in their jobs, often literate, this made the planters uncomfortable. But we'll see what happens in a bit on that. So everything was going fine until 1775. Now, of course, you know the story of what happened up in New England in April 19th. You have the battles of Lexington and Concord, which opened the American Revolution. Now, in Virginia, things began to get hot the previous month when Patrick Henry gave his famous speech calling for liberty or death. Now, that speech was designed to convince these conservative gentry to set up a militia outside of Dunmore's control. Dunmore, when he learned of this, realized that he could no longer sit on the fence between the Patriots and the Loyalists. He had to choose. And on April 21st, 2 days after the battles in Lexington and Concord, but before news had reached Virginia of the conflict there, he had small amounts of gunpowder in the powder magazine in Williamsburg, shown there in the upper right, seized and taken aboard a ship. Now, when an Armagh protested, he convinced them that he had taken this powder in order to protect it because of a slave insurrection that was rumored to be in the works. Now, this apparently was a rumor that had concerned enough white Virginians that they bought Dunmore's explanation and they withdrew. But the next day, when Dunmore got word that a member of the Williamsburg Council had threatened one of his officers, He threatened that he would declare freedom to the slaves if attacked. And this was a stunning statement by the man whose primary job was to prevent slave insurrections. Now, Virginia's Achilles heel really was this enormous enslaved population. How can you foment a rebellion against Britain when you are enslaving so many tens of thousands of people? Now, there are a couple of problems for the Patriots. First of all, the small planters were not really interested in rebelling against the British Empire. It simply didn't make sense to them. They weren't as interested in speculating in land. They didn't really drink much tea. There really was no clear reason for them to side with this new movement. Mostly these were gentry people. But guns and ammunition were essential to them in order to control their enslaved people. If you're living on a remote plantation far from any kind of militia or help, it was up to you and your gun to prevent a slave insurrection and to protect your family. Now, Patrick Henry understood this, and after the magazine incident of April 1775, he wrote to a friend that, you can talk to people about the duties on tea, but if you tell them of the robbery of the powder at the magazine and that the next step will be to disarm them, they will be ready to fly to arms to defend themselves. They feared that the British might take their weapons, leaving them defenseless. And this was a national security threat in a slave society. The British had no plan to do this. There is no evidence whatsoever. And at that point, there were only a few dozen Marines in Virginia and a couple of small ships. There was simply no main British force. But in the wake of this incident, small planters really bought the line that Patrick Henry was selling, and they flocked to the Patriot cause. And this is what really began the revolution in Virginia. Now, meanwhile, Lord Dunmore, who was in the capital at Williamsburg until June of 1775, he has to leave. There's a plot against his life. He moves to a base near Norfolk on the coast, and there he wants to create his effort to destroy the Patriot movement. Now, as he moves to Norfolk, something very interesting and important happens. Enslaved people who had gotten word that he had earlier in April said that he might be willing to offer them freedom begin to flock to the Royal Navy ships in the harbor. They ask for sanctuary. They're granted sanctuary. And this, in turn, infuriates the Patriots. Why? Because it's proof of British tyranny. After all, these black people are considered under Virginia law to be human property. They are private property. And for the British to take them on board was the same as stealing private property. And if a government is stealing your private property, well, then that's a tyrannical government. So this is what really angered whites in Virginia and really pushed them to be sympathetic to the Patriot cause. Now, the Patriots demanded the return of these enslaved people, but the conflict really came to a head over a man named Joseph Harris. He was a pilot in the small port of Hampton near Norfolk, and he chose to side with the British. He was working for them as a pilot. He was very valuable to them. He knew the waters. And when the Patriots demanded his return, there was a war of words in the newspapers that eventually led to the first battle, the first bloodshed south of Massachusetts. And this took place on October 27, 1775, when a small group of British ships sailed into the harbor. They began to bombard the town, but they were forced to retreat under a hail of fire from these fierce riflemen from Western Virginia. And though the British pulled out, this really was the beginning of the war in the South. And an extremely important moment, and we'll get into that soon. Now, Thomas Jefferson in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, he made the comment, well, Lord Dunmore has commenced hostilities. It has raised our country into a perfect frenzy. Everything changed when bloodshed began in Virginia. Patrick Henry begins to assemble a Patriot army, and Dunmore, meanwhile, remember he has very few British soldiers and very few white loyalist soldiers, he secretly begins to train these black men that are arriving at his camp hoping to be free. And this all comes to a head on November 15th, 1775. Arguably, the most important document published in America before the Declaration of Independence. What happened was this. Dunmore is marching through the swamps with his white loyalists, his British redcoats, and also with armed black men. And in the course of this ambush, an armed black man who is fighting for Dunmore captures the Patriot commander. This Patriot commander, in dramatic fashion, happens to be the person who owns the man who captured him. Now, when this black man, whose name we don't know, brings the Patriot commander into camp, Dunmore is clearly impressed, and immediately he publishes the first Emancipation Proclamation in the British Empire. He then formed Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment, a regiment of black soldiers, and their motto is liberty to slaves. Now, consider that the motto that was being worn by the Patriots was liberty or death, right? Patrick Henry's motto. Well, this was a retort to that by slaves saying, look, if you want liberty, then grant liberty to everybody, including to us. So what you have are two Americans, both fighting for liberty, who are now about to clash. Now, we know that thousands of people fled, including men, women, and children, fled their plantations. They fled from the north. They came from as far away as Massachusetts in order to seek freedom. This was America's largest pre-Civil War insurrection. There is nothing that comes close to what happened in these waning days of 1775. And the Patriots absolutely panicked. There was a press campaign against Dunmore. People were warned that he's going to sell you. You can't trust him. He's a drunk. And this is a propaganda campaign that was very effective. We still today hear echoes of that when we read about Lord Dunmore. But it was all designed to convince enslaved people not to leave the plantations, which would have destroyed Virginia's economy. Now, George Washington knew that Dunmore was no fool. He said that if Dunmore is not instantly crushed, he will become the most formidable enemy America has. Pretty big statement for a man who's sitting there in Cambridge looking across the river at some 6,000 British troops and maybe 100 or so large British vessels. The Continental Congress was also concerned. They were so concerned that they raised a small fleet, and its first mission, what became the U.S. Navy, the first mission was to sail to Virginia to attack Dunmore's multiracial forces. So by late November 1775, you have the Patriot Army in Williamsburg beginning its march on Norfolk. So you have the two sides set for a big clash. And that clash takes place at a place called Great Bridge. Now, it was actually yesterday was our 250th anniversary of this really key battle, which is widely known as the Bunker Hill of the South, with the exception, as Commander Woodford noted, he was the Patriot commander. He said, with the exception that, unlike at Bunker Hill, we kept the field. So this is a key crossing to get to Norfolk. If you wanted to get to Norfolk by land, you had to cross this bridge. You can see it there at the bottom right. Where you see the fort with the A in it. That was a British fort built by black and black regiment members as well as British redcoats. And on the other side of the river to the above, you see the earthworks that were built by the Patriots just south of town. Now, at this point, you have the first clashes between Patriot and black soldiers. So you have soldiers who are black Americans dressed in redcoats with muskets who are attacking Patriots. This is the first time this happens in American history. And on December 9th, there is a final large battle that takes place. And in this, the British and the Loyalists are defeated. They're simply outnumbered. They're forced to retreat back to Norfolk, and they get on board ships in the harbor of Norfolk. And so you have this massive flotilla of maybe 3,000 people, 100 vessels, everyone scrambling to get on board a ship underneath the guns of the British warships so they will not be killed or maimed or harmed when this flood of 1,500 or so angry patriots arrives in Norfolk, which they do on December 14th. The Patriots then install snipers in the warehouses along the river. And if you are on this flotilla and come above deck, then they'll take pot shots at you. And now, that is obviously not a situation that can last long. You have these two sides squaring off just a matter of a few hundred yards away from one another. Now, The big question for the Patriots was what to do with Norfolk. They captured this city. But we have to keep in mind that prior to this, as early as the fall of 1775, Patriots were actually calling for its wholesale demolition. In October, Richard Henry Lee said that Norfolk was, well, it was filled with Tories and Negroes. Tories was a term used widely in Virginia, meaning Scottish merchants, and Negroes, many of whom had been freed. This obviously posed a big threat to Virginia's social system. Now, Thomas Jefferson himself wrote in the bottom of the letter, Delenda est Norfolk. That meant Norfolk must be destroyed in Latin. This was a reference to the ancient Roman effort to destroy its rival Carthage on the North African coast. Carthage was attacked, it was laid waste. The residents who weren't killed were sold into slavery, and that was the end of Carthage. So by using this term, Thomas Jefferson is actually saying that a city, in fact, the only city in his colony, should be utterly annihilated. Now, the Patriots denied the rumors that they were going to destroy the city, but as my book shows, they were meanwhile creating a secret plan to do just that. And it all came to a head on January 1st, 1776, the beginning of that fateful year. So at 3 p.m., Dunmore orders a barrage from the ships in order to clear the area so that Black and British troops can land and burn the warehouses where the snipers are housed. This takes place, and they retreat back to the ships. But mysteriously, the fires begin to spread to the city, and they burned for 3 days, destroying virtually the entire town. Now, the Patriots immediately blamed Dunmore. George Washington himself said that the destruction would unite the whole country. And keep in mind, if you had heard this news that Norfolk had been burned by the British, then, and you live in Charleston or Philadelphia or New York, then you wondered, will we be next? So this helped to really ignite calls for independence that up until this time was something that only radicals like John Adams were talking about in any kind of serious fashion. But the truth is that Norfolk was not burned by Lord Dunmore or the British. In fact, a Patriot report done by the Patriots themselves determined the following year that 96% of the town was burned intentionally by the Patriots. It's very shocking, but it's true. There are witness depositions that show very clearly that the Patriots engaged in all kinds of pillage and intentional burning, and where civilians themselves were harshly treated. Now, this report mysteriously vanished for 60 years. When it did resurface by then, this story that the British had burned Norfolk, that Lord Dunmore was a villain, the story that I learned as a child, was long entrenched. So despite the fact that we have this information, it's still widely considered a British war crime. In fact, it really backlashed against Virginia because Scottish merchants were deported, and that was a huge loss to Virginia's economy, and Virginia eventually became an economic backwater after the war. Chief Justice John Marshall, probably our most famous Supreme Court justice, he said that it was one of those ill-judged measures of which the consequences are felt long after the motives are forgotten. Now, he should have known. He was a young soldier who was there. He witnessed the burning of Norfolk and realized that it was a terrible error that would set his colony, his state, back by many decades, which in fact it did. Now, if you saw the Ken Burns series, then you would have thought, well, you wouldn't know that Norfolk was burned. It wasn't mentioned. And you wouldn't know that Dunmore remained a potent threat to the Patriots. Despite Norfolk's destruction, this flotilla remained in the harbor. You still had several thousand civilians and soldiers on the fleet. They created a land base nearby. This became this fascinating multiracial society. It didn't last long, but it was an existential threat to Virginia's patriots. Dunmore was even planning an assault on Williamsburg using his black troops. Remember, enslaved people kept arriving in large numbers, and although some were dying of disease, more kept arriving. But the British in London and in Boston simply did not understand the value of attacking Virginia. Instead, the British decided to invade the Carolinas. And that effort to take Charleston turned into a fiasco. The British failed. They had to withdraw. And Dunmore remained virtually on his own in what was, at that point, a very vulnerable colony. What changed everything was a virus and a vote. So in May 1776, there was an outbreak of smallpox among the fleet in Norfolk. So they had to relocate to Gwynn's Island in order to inoculate the black soldiers, because that took them offline. People like a COVID vaccine, you're sick for a bit. So he had to find a safe place. It seemed like a good idea. It was a rather remote island in the Chesapeake Bay. Meanwhile, in Williamsburg, the Patriot planters have decided that this threat by Dunmore and this threat to free enslaved people are major factors in why it is now time for Virginia to call for independence from Britain. And they also urge the Continental Congress to do the same. So this resolution that was introduced in Congress on June 7th is what broke the deadlock. States like Pennsylvania, New York, and the Carolinas that had been kind of on the fence decided that if Virginia, the largest colony, was going to go for independence, then it was time. So this was the big shift. July 4th, of course, the Declaration was adopted. And then 5 days later, the Patriot forces finally get their act together. They attack Dunmore's forces, force the British fleet to leave the Chesapeake, and Dunmore and his Ethiopian soldiers then travel to New York, where they become part of the invasion force that forces Dunmore's former friend, George Washington, to abandon that city for the wilds of New Jersey. So it's a great story that has been too little told and often too inaccurately told. But what I find most interesting, and before we get to questions, is that the ripple effects of what Dunmore did, and more importantly, what these enslaved people did, really affects us down to this day. Number one, George Washington, when he took command of the Continental Army in 1775, demanded that all black soldiers be refused if they wanted to enlist and not be allowed to re-enlist if they were already in the army. Remember, many of them fought at Bunker Hill. Now, as soon as he got word of Dunmore's proclamation, Washington immediately reversed himself. He realized the value of having black soldiers, and by the end of the war, the Continental Army was the most integrated force in American history until, wait for it, the Korean War. Pretty big side effect. Now, keep in mind, though, that there were 3 times the number of people who fought for the British, black Americans who fought for the British, than fought for the American patriots. The reason is obvious. Which side was offering mass emancipation? It was not the patriot side. So it's clear that if you were an enslaved person and you valued liberty, it was a no-brainer who you would fight for if given the choice. Now, Lord Dunmore, meanwhile, didn't just vanish. He did go back to England, but he came back in 1781 thinking that Lord Cornwallis was going to conquer Virginia. He'd be back in the palace. But when he arrived in Charleston, discovered to his dismay Cornwallis had lost the war, he actually put forward a plan to free 10,000 black men and march them up to Williamsburg in order to end the war. Now, of course, by this point, it was too late. And some 10,000 black Americans ultimately were forced to leave the land of liberty or face re-enslavement when the British evacuated places like New York. But what's really interesting is that Dunmore's proclamation lived on in other, even more important ways. It gave Lincoln a legal precedent for his more famous 1863 decree. Dunmore started something that really began to snowball and finally ended at the door of the White House during the Civil War. So we are 250 years old. We're no longer 10 years old. And I think that this is a story that can help us to step out of some of the older, more worn stories that we were raised with. First of all, with all due respect for you New Englanders among us, the Revolution's start was more than Lexington and Concord. You really needed to have the South, and particularly Virginia, in order to have a continental rebellion rather than just a regional conflict. So I think we want to shift our focus to include what took place in the South so that we get that fuller picture. I also think it's very important to seek the origins of today's conflicts over race and guns and immigration. I'm a big believer in if you have a problem, go to the source. And I was really surprised in my research to discover that many of the sources of what's in the headlines today can be traced back to what took place in the South in those early years of the nation, particularly in Virginia and particularly around 1775 and 1776. I think it goes without saying that it's high time that we celebrate those on both sides who fought for liberty during the American Revolution. After all, if we're a nation founded on an ideal, that is, liberty and freedom, rather than on a religion or an ethnicity or a language, that it is really important for us to acknowledge those people who valued freedom so much that they were willing to risk their lives, and very often took even harder steps than those of, say, the white patriots. If you were an enslaved person in a forced labor camp, simply stepping away was something where you could risk torture or imprisonment or even death. So simply to arrive at British lines showed that you had a real tenacity in your belief for freedom. And ultimately, I think that this anniversary gives us a great opportunity to reaffirm those famous words that Thomas Jefferson gave us, to really reaffirm that liberty and equality are central tenets of the nation. And with this anniversary coming up, I think there's no better time to reevaluate who we are and where we want to go. And with that, I'll be happy to take some questions. I think first we have a few questions already submitted, and then we can go to those from the audience. So thank you very much. I know that was a lot in a short period, but we'll have a little conversation now.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm going to kick things off here with one of the questions that we received from the audience in advance. Did Dunmore's view on abolition and civil rights for Black people change after forming the Ethiopian Brigades?
Well, first of all, one question I often get is, why did he call it the Ethiopian Regiment? You know, after all, most of these people were from West Africa, right? And Ethiopia is in East Africa. So it's worth mentioning that that Ethiopia was a Christian country that was much admired by Europe. So it was a rare term of respect used by white Europeans in speaking about Black Africans. So I think that's number one, that Dunmore didn't just call it an Ethiopian regiment, he called it Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. So, in short, I think that Lord Dunmore's views evolved. Yes, he was a slave owner, like others, like George Washington, but over time, I think he came to see the value of these Black men, their capacity to be loyal, to fight hard. And I also think that as a Highlander who had endured the depredations following the rebellion of 1745, where you couldn't wear a kilt, you couldn't speak Gaelic, I think he understood oppression in a way that a lot of English whites from England did not. So I think this gave him a little more of an open mind. So he was able, although not an abolitionist at all, he was able to see the value of these people, and he didn't leave them behind. And I think it says a lot about who he was, that he didn't just dump these people, he took them with him when he left. There's no evidence that he abandoned anybody or sold anybody.
Excellent. I have another question here that came in advance. Did any freed slaves change to support the rebels, the revolutionaries?
Hmm. Well, if you were an enslaved person, certainly there were a few who did fight for the Patriots, but often consider the circumstances. In Virginia, there were several cases where a enslaved person went to fight instead of their owner, and they were promised freedom at the end of the war, not when they joined, but maybe at the end. Some of them received emancipation, but many did not. Many were forced back into slavery. So it really wasn't a good bet if you were enslaved to go with the Patriots. Now, in the North, there were fewer enslaved people, but there were some. But primarily, you have free people of color who joined the Continental Army and who became a very important part of Washington's force. At the Battle of Yorktown, for example, the Rhode Island Regiment was there, mostly Black regiment, which fought very hard in a distinguished way. So it really was the free Black people who came, who really stuck to the American cause, while those who were enslaved inevitably went to the British, because there was Lord Dunmore's proclamation, and there were additional proclamations during the war by British leaders that encouraged them to join British forces.
Thank you.
Our next question is, in your research, did you uncover anything about the impact of the Somerset decision in England on Southern enslavers?
Oh, great question. So I'll give a little background for people. This is a very important court case, arguably the most important in that era. It was a case where a slave who actually had been brought to Africa and was sold in Norfolk. He was bought by a Scottish merchant who then took him back years later to London. Now, when this enslaved person, his name was James Somerset, got to London, he said, great. He took off, he vanished, but his owner managed to recapture him and sold him into slavery, sent him on a ship that was going to Jamaica. Now, fortunately, James Somerset had some abolitionist friends. They heard of this and they sent word to the Chief Justice of England saying, this isn't right. And sure enough, the Chief Justice agreed to hear the case. It became a cause célèbre in England, and eventually James Somerset was released because, as the Justice said, we don't have any laws on slavery, so we can't impose laws that haven't been placed. And this was news that was trumpeted around the colonies. So there was great fear, both in the North and the South, in the colonies, that the British government intended to free those who were enslaved in the Americas. So this is a kind of an underlying anxiety that's there prior to the revolution, which I think definitely is a factor in encouraging people to think about separating from Britain so they don't have to confront this threat. Yeah, it's a great story. James Somerset was a fascinating character, and we have so much about him, and it's a really rare example of an enslaved person who managed to go through the legal system. And I should also mention the Chief Justice who argued the case. He was a cousin of Lord Dunmore. Small world.
We're definitely getting some questions about the Somerset decision in our live questions. So thank you for covering that so thoroughly. If folks have a more detailed question that he didn't cover, put it again in the chat. Otherwise, we'll think those Somerset questions are resolved. Another question here, an advanced question. Have you visited current descendant communities of Black Loyalists or the Black Loyalist Heritage Center in Nova Scotia?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I kind of fooled my partner. I suggested a vacation in Nova Scotia and said, "Oh, there's this. Oh, let's drive down the coast. Oh, look, here's the Black Loyalist Heritage Center. Let's stop." Yeah, this is a fascinating place. I highly encourage anybody who goes to Nova Scotia to visit it. So this is the story. I mentioned New York. So in New York at the end of the war in 1783, you had 3,000 people who had been enslaved, but the British had freed. Many of these had been freed by Dunmore, others by later generals. So you have 3,000 Black people who have been free in many cases for 7 or 8 years. Suddenly, the British are going to leave, and George Washington is going to march into the city. And those people were to be re-enslaved because under the Treaty of Paris, the British had agreed to return all property, which included Black people who'd been enslaved, to the Patriots. Now, George Washington didn't want to wait. He himself sent slave catchers into British-occupied New York in order to get back those people who had abandoned Mount Vernon. Fortunately, when he met with the British commander said, no, we're not going to turn them over. He said, in fact, what we're going to do is we're already sending them on ships to Nova Scotia to get them out of your hands. It was a very honorable decision on the part of the British. So they loaded 3,000 people on board these ships in New York Harbor, and most of them ended up in various towns along the coast of Nova Scotia. Now, life was really hard there. About half of them then later determined it was time to leave. They went back to Africa, and they founded the first colony for emancipated enslaved people. That was the colony of Sierra Leone. Of course, Liberia was the American version that happened later. So some of these people led incredible lives. Harry Washington, born in Africa, bought by George Washington in Virginia, escapes to Lord Dunmore, fights for the British in New York and in Charleston, then ends up going to Nova Scotia on this evacuating ship, and then goes to Sierra Leone, where he decides these missionaries who are running Sierra Leone are actually not allowing the Black people to govern themselves. And he foments a rebellion. And Unfortunately, it's put down and he's exiled. Last we hear of him. But, these fantastic lives of these Black loyalists, which, we don't have a lot of information, but they certainly really, I think, paint a much fuller picture of the impact of the American Revolution.
Thank you for that. Do you know how many Black loyalists left Boston with the British in 1776 to
I
follow up on
wish
that
I
question?
did. This is a great question. We do know that when the British evacuated in the spring of 1776, that there were some Black people aboard those ships. We don't have a manifest that gives us their names. We don't know if they were free or enslaved. You have to remember that although we tend to think of enslaved society as being a Southern society, in fact, places like New York and Boston, New York, I think, had 10 to 20% Black population, mostly enslaved. That was probably about the same for Boston. So there were enslaved people in Boston in 1776. Whether or not they were able to be freed and then leave and go to Nova Scotia or to England is not clear. We just don't have enough information, but certainly some of the first Black people who left America left with the British when Boston was evacuated.
Excellent. So many good questions that we're getting here. Uh, so many folks, both live and in our advanced questions, read your criticism of Ken Burns's American Revolution documentary series. I published an article in the American Scholar. So one person wants to know, have you received a response? Another person asks and says that your comments were so astute. Do you have any other gems of comments? And then we've got one in the chat, as long as we cover these all at once here. Oh my. Okay, let's see. Uh, yeah, you start answering and I'll find this other one. There was
Okay.
another good question.
Well, my phone has been on mute for the past hour, so so Ken Burns may have called in the intervening time, but I sort of doubt it. I admire Ken Burns. Anybody who can bring really good scholarly history to the masses, I think, deserves to be celebrated. And Ken Burns has done it like nobody else in the past 30 years. So that's the first thing to say is that, it's easy to shoot down people who take on big projects. So I don't want to be that person. That said, I think it's really important to look at the details. And the second episode, I really encourage people to watch the second episode of the Ken Burns series. In that, he does deal with Virginia. And he does talk about Lord Dunmore to an extent that has not been discussed widely. He does give a place for the South in the beginning of the war. However, there are numerous errors, and I ascribe these less to Ken Burns than I do to historians who, over the past century or two, have, number one, not examined the propaganda that was created around Lord Dunmore. And hey, they've simply kind of passed along these ideas that he was a drunk, he was a fool, he was just using these Black people, he didn't care about them. And I think that's unfortunate because we know better. We actually know that Dunmore was not like that at all. Um, Also, he underestimates the power of Dunmore's flotilla, which I think really drove the Virginia Patriots to seek independence unanimously. It was a really astonishing decision. And arguably, without that decision, there could have been no United States. There would have been no way without Virginia saying yes that these other states would have gone along with this crazy idea. So I think the pressure that Dunmore exerted on the Patriots has to be taken into account, and that is not mentioned. Finally, Ken Burns doesn't give the least moment to discuss the burning of Norfolk. Now, the January 1st, 1776 destruction of that city was so important at the time, but it has been lost. The importance of it has been lost. Think of it. This is the only time in American history that an entire city has been annihilated. And it was done by the British? Well, that's been the thinking, but of course it wasn't done by the British. It was a very, very clever operation on the part of patriots to blame the British for something that they did themselves. And I think this is a fantastic story. These witness depositions provide, lots of great characters that he could have brought out. Of course, the American Revolution is long and complicated, but I am sorry that Ken Burns did not focus on some of these really dramatic events where there's some individuals, many of whom I profile in my book, who would be great to follow because they really give you a sense of you are there in a way that's very difficult to find in other sources.
I did find that follow-up question, which this woman says, "Thanks. Indeed, slavery was a critical driver in the American Revolution, both North and South, a fact that is bypassed in the documentary." So that's
Well, and let me just, I want to just add one little nuance to that. I'm talking about Virginia. Okay, so in Virginia, there's no question that the fact that enslaved people left in droves to join the British helped to push the Patriots for to call for independence. Same was true in South Carolina, to a lesser extent North Carolina. In the North, it was a smaller factor. It simply was not the economics was different. The enslaved populations in the South really drove those economies. Enslaved people in the North did not. They were mostly urban people, and they lived in a very different kind of slave system, still slavery. So I just want to create that nuance because there's been a lot of discussion about was slavery the reason for the revolution? The answer is no. It was an important reason. In Virginia, it was the top reason, but in other places, it was different. So I think it's important to keep that nuance so that we don't try and make broad statements that could be shot down.
thank you. Yes, indeed.
Thank you for that. Before we go to some live questions, can you, Andrew, address maybe your research process and your writing process? Tell us a little bit about how you went about your research and how you put the book together, if you would.
It's very messy. Talk about making sausages. I mean, I was very naive. I'm a journalist by training. I thought, oh, these historians will have a website. I go to it, I'll find all of Lord Dunmore's correspondence. I'll find, all this information about enslaved people. Boy, was I naive. You really have to dig. There is no one source for anything involving the American Revolution. There's Founders Online, which has the correspondence of famous people in the revolution, patriots, but even that is not fully complete. So I had to really go everywhere, both online as well as to Scotland. I spent a lot of time in the National Library in Edinburgh, which was fantastic. I got to actually look at letters written in Norfolk that were mailed to Scotland that are still there, talking about the events that took place there. So it was horrible trying to read 18th century scrawl. I mean, I assume there's like a program I could just put it in and it'll read it for me. No, 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 no. I had to learn how to do it myself, and that was challenging. But it was really wonderful to see the original documents and to be able to work with those so that I'm seeing it for myself, not through some editor's eyes. I also spent time and had to do hard time in some castles in Scotland where the Dunmore's family, the Murrays, like Blair Castle, for example, they had a great little like a medieval tower that was a library. So there was a lot of fun in exploration in trying to dig up some of these more obscure pieces. I wanted to get a fuller sense of who this guy was, and that required me to really dig into his past. And I should also mention, I also had to sail across the Atlantic because, Lord Dunmore did it, right? He sailed from Britain to New York, so I couldn't get a ride on any kind of British naval vessel, so I had to settle for the Queen Mary.
Oh, that's tough tour of duty there.
Yeah, well, and I hope the IRS understands that it really was a business trip.
Yes, definitely. Absolutely. Okay, so just backing up a little more History 101 here. Two things, combining two questions. Was New York considered to be a royal colony too? I personally toured the State House recently in Boston, and I learned a lot about royal governors. So
Yeah.
we assume that New York had a royal governor as well. But I'll answer that. And then a question has come up about the snake that you showed, join or die, and the order of the colonies in the snake. How does that come about? Virginia has a big twist on it. It's led by New England, not by Mass Bay Colony. So anyway, just back us up through some of these things if you could.
Yeah, so New York was a royal colony. I mean, there were very different ways. I mean, every colony was different. They had different charters, different histories. But New York was a little bit like Virginia in that a royal governor was appointed by the king to serve. But keep in mind, these royal governors were not very powerful. These were kind of guys, civil servant guys that kind of came and went like political appointees. They would kind of come and go. And it was really the people there in the colonies, the gentry. In New York, it was two or three very powerful families that were always fighting with each other. In Virginia, you had the tobacco gentry. They were the ones really running the show. Much like the king, the governors, they couldn't initiate legislation. They couldn't appropriate money. They really had to depend on their parliament, on their elected assemblies in order to do anything. So I think it's important to remember that because we tend to be taught that the British had a tyrannical system when in fact the government we adopted, is so strongly similar to the British government. And it really was a not so radical a change because we were so steeped in that kind of Anglo heritage. And the royal governors were weak. Lord Dunmore really had to make friends with the gentry. He couldn't make enemies of them. So I think it's important to keep that in mind that King George similarly was limited in his power, unlike say the King of France. It was not a tyrannical system that often we're told it was. That's I think a way to justify the myth of the revolution. But in fact, we were fighting over different kinds of issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, didn't the British press the escaped slaves into British service? Can you speak to that?
Yes. The war was long, and there were many British commanders, and they all dealt with enslaved people differently. Lord Dunmore, as I mentioned, he was able to free them and then take them with him to New York, where many of them became part of the Black Pioneers. Now, they were then under General Clinton. Now, Clinton did not want to give black men guns, unlike Dunmore, who was happy to train them and trusted them. Clinton did not, but he used them for digging trenches, doing military exercises in other ways, but not in battle. So that was also the case with Lord Cornwallis, who may have lost the war for Britain because he failed to make use of the thousands of enslaved people who flocked to British lines simply wanting protection and wanting freedom. Had he taken the direction that Lord Dunmore had taken, the war might have turned out quite differently. So different commanders did things differently. Lord Dunmore, as I mentioned at the end, when he wanted to create that army to march up to Virginia in 1781, he demanded that those people be freed and promised that their freedom would be maintained, that they be paid, that they be allowed to be promoted to the officer corps if they, had showed gumption. And so I think there were those who were thinking in very creative ways, and then others who were like Cornwallis, who were stuck in the prejudices of the day.
I think we've got time for one or two more questions here. A live question. Dunmore abandoned blacks on Gwynn's Island to suffer from smallpox and starvation. Did this include women and children? Was there a negative backlash by black people in Virginia, i.e., to join the Patriot causes?
Now, this was talked about in the Ken Burns documentary, and I wrote about this in my piece in American Scholar. And I'm a little hot under the collar about this because the quote that he uses is clearly a piece of patriot propaganda. There are letters that were written from Gwynn's Island by patriot officers that mentioned there were a few people who were left behind. But keep in mind, the Patriots attacked, and Dunmore and his forces had to immediately get on their ships. Were they going to bring people who were dying of smallpox onto ships packed with 3,000 people, or would they leave them behind? This is a hard decision. It's clear from their correspondence that they felt really badly. They felt like it wasn't handled well. But the numbers of people who were dying were exaggerated by the Patriots. I showed this in my book. And it was a piece of patriot propaganda. That, gosh, look, Dunmore is just treating these enslaved people so badly, he left them to die. But this is part of the narrative that the Patriots had to create in order to prevent enslaved people from seeking liberty. So it's really important to look at these statements not as truth necessarily, but as, in a political context. And you've got to look at like a letter that somebody writes to somebody that's not going into a newspaper that probably is a little more credible, particularly if it comes from an experienced officer. So that was one example where I think Ken Burns was using this letter to kind of convey this idea that the British had treated the blacks poorly and thereby preventing Americans, I think, from really looking really closely at the impact of slavery on the American Revolution and the role that patriots had in it.
Well, there is so much research that we can do on these topics, and I really appreciated your book. As I said, I we learned a tremendous amount reading it, and I that brings us really to the top of our hour. And I just want to thank you for opening our eyes to these various interpretations and to this history that, as I said, so many of us don't truly understand, even those of us from your region. There's so much more to learn. I want to remind our audience that we encourage you, colonial and revolutionary fans, to read for yourself this remarkable work, A Perfect Frenzy, based on the Thomas Jefferson quotation. I love the title. Especially, we should be reading this as we all get up to speed about the 250th anniversary year of the signing of the Declaration. We are in a very hot week for the topic of this book, right through to New Year's Day. So we're right in the middle of the 250th for this story. You can, of course, get a copy from your library of A Perfect Frenzy from your local library. And we're going to be putting in the chat some links to the Boston Public Library version for you local folks. Or you can purchase this for yourself, for your friends or family, specially signed copies of this book. Andrew Lawler has signed some book plates for us. They can be ordered from our partners at Porter Square Books in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Use the code AMINTS25 so the bookstore knows that you are connected to this event and you should get a book signed by the author on a book plate. The bookstore can send these special books to you anywhere, to anyone in the United States. Unfortunately, they can't go up to Canada. So folks in Nova Scotia, you're going to have to find the book on your own. I'm sure you can. For history buffs, this could be a really wonderful gift. Winding down our evening together, first, Kristen's going to tell you what's upcoming from the Boston Public Library.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for being here with us this evening, and we would love to share with you that you can find out more about resources, programs, and services for people of all ages, both in person and online at bpl.org or at your local neighborhood branch. This winter, keep an eye out for upcoming virtual programs from the Boston Public Library and citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library. In January with NYU psychology professor Dr. John Yost, and also in February with Dr. Beverly Tatum. So keep an eye out for these programs aligned with the library's upcoming theme in 2026, Revolutionary Ideas. We hope to see you again online or in person. Thank you. Margaret, back over to you.
Thank you, Kristen. We at American Ancestors are delighted to have co-presented tonight's talk with you. If you in the audience are researching a person, a family, a conflict, a community, my colleagues are here to help. You'll see on screen some of the many educational programs ahead from our Brew Family Learning Center. Many of them are free to the public, as tonight's talk was. Also free of charge, you can chat with our genealogists. Better yet, visit us in Boston at 97 Newbury Street. We would love to meet you here and show you what we do. Our mission in everything at American Ancestors, everything we do, is to educate, inspire, and connect people and to get them thinking about history and particularly their family. For you literary sorts, we hope you'll join us for more author talks ahead. In the new year, we'll dive deeper into America's colonial and revolutionary history. On Jan 12, we'll focus on the Great Wagon Road and James Dodson's new book, The Road That Made America. On Jan 21, we'll welcome the author and historian Rick Atkinson, who was most recently featured on Ken Burns's Revolution series. He'll be discussing the craft of writing history His book, The Fate of the Day, and his revolutionary trilogy. He'll be discussing those with American Ancestors President Ryan J. Woods. And in February, we'll explore Black history and the evolution of television and its programs. We start in on February 4 with Judith Geisberg's book, Last Seen: The Enduring Search by Formerly Enslaved People to Find Their Lost Families. But back to tonight, many thanks to our guest speaker, Andrew Lawler. We're grateful to the Boston Public Library AV team, particularly Amanda Andrews, for tonight's tech production. Thanks to all of you in the audience tonight. We are so glad you joined us. We appreciate and applaud your interest in history, and we hope we will see you soon again. For now, a good night from all of us from Boston and also from down south, Andrew in Asheville. Thank you for being with us. We appreciate it.